This shows you the process that we went through over the fall, winter, and summer of 2007 with the creation of the project in the beginning. We made the list that I told you about. The list was analyzed and grouped into the 4 areas. We gathered experts from all around the world in anesthesia, surgery, nursing, biomedical engineering, hospital administration, and we brought them all together in Geneva multiple times. We created small working groups to narrow down that list of 200 to a list that finally ended up at 19. The checklist was tested first on a small scale in a handful of hospitals and modified. It then was studied in a study that I'm sure most of you are aware of that was published in the New England Journal 2 years ago. And then it was launched and has been spread since then around the world and in the United States. This is the current version of the WHO Surgical Safety Checklist, and I'm going to share with you a number of versions that have been modified from this as well. That checklist, the one that I just showed you, or a version of it, the wording was slightly different than this one, was actually taken and studied in the pilot study that I referred to just a second ago that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I can tell you just a little bit about that pilot study since I was intimately involved in its performance. It was done at 8 sites that were spread around the world, evenly divided between countries very similar to our own, like Canada, United States, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand, and then countries from both the developing world and the world in transition in Jordan, the Philippines, India, and in Tanzania. So many, many different environments the checklist was studied in. Nearly 8,000 patients were enrolled in the study, 4,000 before the checklist was put into place and then 4,000 afterwards. And the findings were pretty remarkable. Here you can see the principal results that came from the study, and the first thing to note is that all of the things that are listed here changed in a significant way from baseline to after the checklist was put into place. You can see that mortality associated with surgery fell nearly in half, that the complication rate fell by about 40%, that the surgical site infection rate dropped by about 40%, and that unplanned return to the operating room also fell significantly. One of the things that we did, in addition to looking at patient outcomes and how well people were able to perform the checklist, was to ask them at the end what they thought about the checklist and how it may have affected care in their own operating rooms. And one of the things that I think was very interesting is shown on this slide. Up at the top, the checklist was easy to use. 4 out of 5 people thought so. The checklist improved operating room safety. 4 out of 5 people thought so. So the world splits kind of 80-20 when you ask them questions, positive and negative, about the checklist. About 20% of people think it takes too long to do it. But if you drop down to the very end, the very last question that we asked, if I were having an operation, I would want the checklist to be used for me. That rises into the 90s. So even people who are unhappy because it takes a long time, even though they didn't think it was particularly easy to use, they would want people to go through that extra trouble for them if they were to have an operation. Now I want to spend a minute talking to you about a special site. This was one of the sites that came from the pilot sites from the developed world. So a hospital very similar to the ones that you work in every single day. And what it shows is something that I think is powerfully interesting about how the checklist works. You know, when we talk to people and try and encourage them to use the checklist, one of the things that we always hear is that we already do all that. And this hospital could have said the very same thing to us. So if we look at the top, That indeed in this hospital wasn't a lie. Antibiotics given in the 0 to 60-minute appropriate time interval, 98% at baseline, with no improvement following putting the checklist into place. Adherence to 6 important safety indicators, 94% before the checklist is put into place, and virtually no change after the checklist is put into place. So they could have answered that question, we already do all that, and honestly said, well, they pretty much did do all that. But I want you to look at something else, and that's what happened at this site down at the bottom, because I think there's a powerful message in it. Surgical site infection rate fell in half. The death rate from surgery also decreased, and the complication rate overall, more than just infections, fell from 11.5% to 7%. Well, what's doing that? And what's doing it, I think, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this, are the other things that the checklist does besides the ones that you think that you're already doing very, very well. And that centers around communication and teamwork.